In today's video, we're going to look at the Caro-Kann Panov-Botvinnik attack from the black side. So if you play the Caro-Kann, if you play 1e4, or if you want to learn about different pawn structures coming out of the Caro-Kann, isolated queen pawn, hanging pawns, pawn tension, this video is going to be very instructive. So these recommendations come from the ChessGoals Caro-Kann course, and we're looking at this line after the trade on d5, pawn to c4, the Panov-Botvinnik attack. Now, I'm recommending knight to f6. This is the strongest move in the position. The knight helps defend this pawn on d5. So this is the pawn tension that we're going to focus on in this position. Knight c3, most common move. Knight c6. So we're going to look for a dynamic system where we quickly get the pieces out, and we don't want to box in the c8 bishop. So some of the Panov lines you'll see for black plays an early e6, but then that bishop gets trapped behind this pawn chain. So we're going to play active, knight c6, knight f3 by white. And now this is a rare move that we recommend in the ChessGoals course, pawn to a6. It looks funny. Why are we just moving a rook pawn when we still have two minor pieces to develop? But there's a reason behind this move. It's a flexible move. It's very safe because a lot of times what white will do is they'll put pieces on this diagonal, whether it's the bishop coming out to b5 or the queen coming out to a4. Right, one of these pieces wants to come to this diagonal eventually, and that can cause some tactical issues. But the other thing this move does is it sort of forces white to make a decision with the c pawn. So we're going to look at three different options here for white. First, we're going to look at what happens if white captures on d5. Then we're going to look at what happens if white pushes past with pawn to c5. And then third, we'll look at what happens if white holds this tension between the two pawns. All right, so first, capture. C takes d5, the main move, and it's probably the strongest move in the position. And I'm recommending you take back with the knight. That one's pretty much forced. After bishop to c4, now our recommendation is bishop to e6. What we want to do is we want to take this isolated queen pawn, the pawn sitting on d4, and we want to put as much pressure on this pawn as possible. So this move looks funny. Why would we trap the pawn on e7? But our plan is pawn to g6, bishop to g7, and from g7, the bishop actually pressures this pawn on d4. It attacks the isolated queen pawn. And when we put our bishop on e6, this also puts the question to the bishop on c4. Because right now we're threatening knight takes c3, which attacks the queen, and it would open up the attack on the bishop. So this leads to a lot of tactical shots. And white pretty much needs to be familiar with these tactics, otherwise they risk making a big mistake here. Bishop to b3, strongest move in the position, putting this bishop back onto a safe square. He's defended by the pawn, he's defended by the queen. But you will note, a lot of players here will play queen to b3. And this is covered in our course because we go through common club level mistakes, but that's a massive blunder. So you'll see that move quite a bit. And we have a free quick start preview of the course. There's a link in the description if you want to check it out. Bishop to b3. Most common move, strongest move. We're going to play knight to a5. Our threat is knight takes b3, and that would gain us the bishop pair. So we would have two bishops to white's one after the trade. Most popular move, bishop back to c2. Now the idea is white wants to play aggressive. They want to attack our king side. So when you have an isolated queen pawn, usually, the side that has the isolated queen pawn needs to create an attack. This pawn gives white a little bit more space in the center, but the pawn could become a long-term weakness in the middle game and into the end game. So white needs to figure out, how can I get compensation for that pawn? Typically, kingside attack. But we play g6, blocking that bishop's diagonal and getting ready to put our bishop on g7, attacking the d4 pawn. Castle by white. And if white ever plays knight to g5 here, you should note it's best to play knight takes c3 hitting the queen, and then plant our bishop on the d5 square. So keep that in mind. You will see some knight g5 hops. Bishop g7 played, and now the most common move is knight g5, and we're going to demonstrate this idea. Knight takes c3, and if white tries knight takes e6 after the trades, this is going to drop the d4 pawn in the end for white. So they play b takes c3. And this creates a position with hanging pawns. These pawns on D and C are called hanging pawns when there's no adjacent pawns on the E file or the B file. And we have the C and D files to play against those pawns. Now the recommendation is bishop to d5. Evaluation here is around minus 0.2, so black already has an advantage. We got the hanging pawns here, and our plan is let's castle. Let's bring the rook over to c8. Let's play h6 to kick the knight out. And we already have a nice blockade on the light squares with this bishop here. And we have this square attacked by our knight, and by the bishop, and by the rook coming on c8. So when you can get those hanging pawns separated like they are here, one's on the 3rd rank, one's on the 4th rank, and then blockade the squares in front of the hanging pawns, that's the best scenario. They like to be side by side and not blockaded. So first line, looking pretty good for black. We're already sitting at a minus 0.2. All right, now let's go back to this position. And instead of capturing on d5, let's see what happens if white commits the pawn up to c5. And now what we can do is play for this pin on the f3 knight, because the f3 knight has a job right now. It wants to defend this pawn on d4. So now we like to talk about the weakest pawn on the board in our Caro-Kann course. The weakest pawn on the board is this pawn on d4. Let's make this guy a target and make it uncomfortable for white. We want to play for the initiative, keep applying pressure, put white on the defensive. Bishop to e2. Now we play g6. We're keeping consistent with the other lines. We want to put the bishop on g7, eventually attack this pawn. Castle by white. And if h3 is played there, what you can do is take the knight, and then we're going to still apply pressure to this pawn. Bishop g7, h3. Now again, whenever you see h3 in these lines, we always want to take the knight. Bishop takes e6. Now in this position, you could argue, well, white has the bishop pair. Don't they have compensation for this weak pawn on d4? According to the engine, it's pretty much exactly equal, but we have a nice plan in mind. We actually want to play the f6 knight back to g8, to e7, to f5, and from there, we're going to have 3 attackers on this pawn. Bishop, knight, and knight all attacking the pawn. And this works because the pawn structure is so solid. And if white's not ready for it, they're going to be in pretty big trouble here. So white has the bishop pair. White has the extra pawn on the queen side, but we have this really nice plan to attack the pawn weakness on d4. All right, so what's the third option? White's going to hold the tension with bishop to g5. They're going to keep this pawn tension here. Now, our recommendation is bishop to e6. And what we're doing here is we see the bishop come to g5. That means there's no knight to g5, the annoying move that can kick our bishop. So whenever you see bishop g5, you know it's safe to play here. And now with the bishop on e6 and the pawn on d5, they both attack that pawn on c4. That puts the question to white. What are they going to do with that c4 pawn? And you might be wondering, well, couldn't white just take this knight and give us doubled pawns? Yes, that's true, and that's the most common move at the club level. So let's look at it and see what happens. Bishop takes f6. We take back with the e pawn. That allows this bishop to develop out that way towards the queen side. Now after c takes d5, bishop takes d5. Currently we have the bishop pair. We have 2 bishops for a bishop and knight. And if white were to take the bishop and remove our bishop pair, that actually gives us a large advantage because that d pawn is going to drop very shortly. And after bishop to e2, now we can stick with our plan. We're still going to put the bishop on g7, create this fianchetto, and long term our bishop pressures d4, castle, bishop g7, and we already have a half pawn advantage according to Stockfish. So what we're going to do here is we're going to castle, we're going to play queen d6, we're going to put a rook on d8, and we're going to play with the initiative, and we're going to go after that weakest pawn on the board, and we're always okay with white trading here because that's going to make it even easier for us to win that d pawn. If you win the d pawn, you're going to be the player pressing for the win in this position. So hope you guys learned something here. Check out the link for the free Caro-Kann course in the description. Make sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't. It's a chess improvement channel. Give us a thumbs up, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.